combination between adjustment and risk approach. So adjustment is, as I've mentioned in previous videos, kind of reactivity to stress, managing different stress levels. Whereas risk approach is really about either taking a proactive or a reactive approach to difficulty and challenge. So people with high risk approach tend to take a more kind of constructive, active approach to solving problems or to conflict or for difficulties. And in leadership, this is particularly important because any problem that exists is not usually going to go away by itself unless it's kind of actively managed and dealt with. So when you're looking at having an interpersonal conflict, for an example, someone with higher risk approach is going to try and manage and resolve that conflict in the most productive way. Whereas someone with really low risk approach is going to take a more kind of reactive, almost instinctual response to it. So that sometimes looks like a flight or fight mechanism. So it's either kind of immediately and emotionally confronting it, reacting to it, or just trying to avoid it, neither of which usually tend to solve problems that well. So that's really useful to look at with adjustment levels too, because sometimes there's an interaction between it, but there's a really, really strong relationship between those stress levels and the level of risk approach and what it looks like in practice. So people who have high risk approach and high adjustment tend to have those more kind of proactive, constructive approaches to problem solving. And if they have high adjustment too, it's not going to be an overly emotional or kind of excessive response to it or an instinctual one. It's better kind of managing it proactively. Whereas sometimes when you see people with really high risk approach, but with really low adjustment, sometimes it's more impulsive behavior and sometimes it's more kind of active behavior, but it can be too aggressive. Sometimes that's a combination that ends up with kind of bullying or aggression because it's a really, really kind of emotional but aggressive response to things, to conflict or difficulty or stress. And that's a problem sometimes for leadership because you need to have those higher levels of adjustment that you're kind of actively and calmly managing problems in the most effective way. But you do also need to be addressing the problems. So that combination is interesting to look at both in high levels and low levels. So if you have someone with really low risk approach and really low adjustment, that's probably higher kind of anxiety, worry, and stress levels, often combined with avoidance. So depending on what your role is in the company or what your job position is, that's not always a problem because it's not everyone's job to always be actively trying to solve problems. If everyone was aggressively trying to solve every single problem in the organization, you'd have even more conflict. So it's good to have people who take a more careful, more cautious approach to risk and to managing those things. But sometimes if you have people who are very stressed and worried about the conflict and are avoiding it, it's going to be more challenging for them to approach it, to deal with it, and to solve problems. So those combinations are really interesting in relationship to the position. So if you've got a role with more responsibility, like a management or a leadership role, usually you need to have a higher level of risk approach because managing and solving conflict is part of your responsibility. Whereas some roles, you've got roles that are not as focused on kind of interpersonal relationships or more technical or specialist roles that you still have to be able to manage and work with other people. But it's okay if you don't have the most active approach to risk because you're more focused on getting your own job done than managing everyone else and their kind of responsibilities and the relationships. So it's good to look at the combinations of those, especially with stress levels, because often when you see lower levels of adjustment, you're going to have those kind of more instinctual, more reactive, often less productive responses to risk, difficulty, or challenge.